it's time to introduce our next speaker of the session, Mr. Gustavo Rojas Ayala. Mr. Ayala currently serves as the General Director for Mexicanos Primero Sinaloa, a nonprofit organization that advocates for children's right to education through research and policy analysis. He also has experience in directing intervention projects aimed at increasing educational justice in Chile and Mexico. He holds a master's degree from Harvard Graduate School of Education, a BA in Journalism and Social Communications from Pontifical Catholic University of Valparaiso, and several international certifications in collective leadership, inclusive education, teaching, and learning in marginalized communities. He is also an Enseña Chile alumni. And here, we feel extremely delighted to have you with us. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Good evening, good morning, depending on wherever in the world you are joining us today. A big thanks to the organizers of this wonderful event for the invitation to participate. I'm honored to be here with you this morning. And before I begin, I wish to thank Dr. Chenraj Royhand, Chairman and Chancellor of Jain deemed to be University. I would like to thank Dr. Raj Singh, Vice Chancellor of Jain deemed to be University, Dr. Dinesh Nilkant, Director of the Center for Management Studies of Jain deemed to be University. And finally, I would also like to thank Dr. Varsha Agarwal, Summit Convener, the Head of Research and Consultancy Cell of the Center for Management Studies of Jain deemed to be University. As I said, I'm very honored and delighted to be here with you today, this morning. It's really early for me. It's 6:34 in the morning here in Sinaloa. So I don't know if anybody from the organizing team could support me with this.
Yes, sir. Should I start? Yeah, I'll do that.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Sure.
Great, and we can jump in straight to slide number 2, so that I can walk us through the itinerary of this conversation. The purpose of our talk, because hopefully we'll get a fair amount of time to exchange views and opinions about this topic. But the main purpose of this conversation is to explore ways in which the crisis that the pandemic caused on education systems also represents opportunities to innovate and to drive change. Some parts of this talk will be based on information that has been generated by international collaboration, multilateral collaboration institutions, with the aims of helping governments to navigate this crisis more effectively. Other parts of this talk will be inspired on my own journey as an educational leader and practitioner, and thereby will include very personal and subjective views about the matter. I will, of course, also draw very heavily on the work experience I have gathered with my colleagues at Mexicanos Primero Sinaloa, where I currently work, and where one of our main interest points over the past 2 years has definitely been the pandemic impact on local education. And after this introductory section, I will start by sharing some of the most relevant known and estimated impacts of the pandemic in global education, so that we can frame the scope and the magnitude of the crisis it generated, to then understand the scope and magnitude of the opportunities to innovate that arise from this crisis. After that, I will share some reflections about the need for collective and adaptive leadership to seize this crisis as an opportunity. I will then move along to a following section where I will discuss some alternatives through which I believe it has been possible to innovate in the way that education systems have responded to this pandemic. And the final section of my presentation will briefly address some opportunities for innovation and change that are proposed by the most recent report by UNESCO, which is a product of the work that they have done through the International Commission on the Futures for Education, that I believe presents very interesting paths for an ongoing discussion about the opportunities to innovate and to drive change in education systems internationally. And finally, we will get to a Q&A section where hopefully we'll get a chance to expand on these topics and to talk about any other issues that are relevant for this event's audience. So can we please move us to the next slide? Okay, perfect. So by now, many of us are probably very well acquainted with some of the most significant impacts of the pandemic over education. Maybe the transition to online instruction or to remote means of instruction has been one of the most immediate and most common ways to respond to the crisis. In many ways, this pandemic and the crisis it brought about in education systems has enabled that spaces like this, conferences like this, are now considered possible, and in many ways even preferable than in-person gatherings. As much as I would have loved to be in India with all of you in person today, it is also important to notice that many of these events transferred to a digital landscape also do have a very positive impact on things like climate change. So it is important not to lose perspective on some of the external benefits that arise from this transition to digital environments. However, a careful review of the available evidence is beginning to show clearly that for many learners, remote instruction has only been a poor replacement for in-person instruction. So I would like us to review some of the most relevant consequences of the decision to close schools for learners, with a specific focus on K-12 students, which is where the main focus of my presentation and my professional experience contribute to. And please move us to the next slide. Okay, so I remember that 2 years ago, during Christmas 2019, I was I think it was after dinner with my family, when I began to see the first reports of a new virus that was impacting the lives of people in China. And only a few weeks or a few months later, we would see that this new virus had been capable of impacting almost every single corner of our planet. And it is very hard to believe that 2 years have already gone by. 2 years of disruption, 2 years of uncertainty, where more than 1.6 billion children have been affected by total and partial school closures. School closures that we as adults, as responsible adults, responded to the uncertainty, to the lack of evidence about the possible risks of transmission of the virus, but that we couldn't be sure if that would have been the decision made by students upon this very same uncertain scenario. But as adults, that's what we decided. That's what our governments decided to do. Our first initial response was to close schools. And in many places like Mexico, schools closures are still being used as a way to mitigate the rates of spread of the new variants of the coronavirus, which severely affects the life of children in ways that we will be able to discuss later. But however, things are different now. Now we know that it is possible to keep schools open following health and safety measures. We also know that, of course, not all schools in all parts of our countries face the same conditions, have the same infrastructure. In some cases, some schools lack some conditions that more affluent zones do offer in their schools. So, but we do know that it is now completely different than it was 2 years ago, and that these differences have made so many countries adapt to the pandemic and do offer in-person instruction more often. Of course, the arrival of new variants, specifically the most recent variant Omicron, that has configured new complex scenarios in many of the countries that have decided to keep their schools open, especially in the northern hemisphere of the world. We see that local and national governments are indeed struggling with teacher shortages produced by the rise in positive COVID-19 cases. However, vaccination has made the consequences of these new waves less lethal than previous ones. And the main concern still remains on how to avoid the collapse of public and private health services. It's not a life or death type of scenario as it used to be maybe 12, 15 months ago. But still, the elements of this crisis configure a very complex scenario. And that complex scenario has moved different countries into different directions. So this graph that we see on the screen was produced by UNESCO's global monitoring of school closures caused by the pandemic. And what it shows, it shows great variance in the types of response. So each color on the screen represents a possible status for schools. For instance, the red color represents times in which schools have been partially open. And the purple color represents times where schools have been closed due to COVID. So wherever you see a purple color, it means that schools have been predominantly closed. And wherever you see red, it shows that schools have been predominantly open, at least partially, right? So the difference of the colors show that countries are doing very different things when it comes to what to do with their schools. And if we move on one more slide, we can see the specific case of India and Mexico. If you look at the upper row, you will see mainly that the main color there is purple. That is Mexico. That represents the fact that during most of these 2-year period, schools in Mexico kept fully closed. And as I said, schools have been officially closed in all of the country a couple of weeks ago. But then if you look at the case of India, what you will see is that schools have been open at least partially for more time than they have in Mexico. Maybe some of you will agree, some others will disagree with this information, because I know that after all, India is a very big, a very diverse country, and national statistics might not always accurately describe the local realities that many of you might be familiar with. And of course, partially open still remains a very broad and a somewhat vague concept. What is actually a partially open school? Is it a school that opens its doors only 1 or 2 days a week? Is it a school that opens its doors every week, every day, for all of their students, or only for a portion of their students? So we still have all of these questions, right? But what we can account for by using this type of evidence is to at least highlight that there is a very different type of management between one country and another one. So places like Mexico and places like India are making completely different decisions about what to do with their schools. And as we saw on the full chart, this is this is representative for a large amount of countries in the world. They're all doing different things. So the big question remains, what are the impacts of this scenario? What are the impacts of this changing, diverse scenario on student learning, and what are the impacts on educational opportunity, on the type of educational opportunities we are offering to our younger generation? Please move us to the next slide. And before we begin answering this question, which as I said, it's important to understand the scope and magnitude of the impact of the pandemic to sort of understand with greater precision what are the possible alternatives to drive innovation. Before answering the question about the impact of the pandemic on learners, it is very important to state that there are some major difficulties here, mainly due to the lack of sufficient official information from governments about the actual impact of the pandemic on student learning levels or in school dropout. For instance, if school is not mandatory, if schooling, in-person schooling is not mandatory for every single student, which is something that many governments have actually, authorized. People can go to schools voluntarily. So that's also part of the definition of partially open, right? Schools are open, but not every student is actually required to attend. It will be very hard for us to really account the magnitude of how many students we lost during this time with school closed, right? School dropout is going to be a very difficult thing to measure precisely through official government data. However, this lack of information in some cases has been countered with projections, with estimations that have built, for instance, upon evidence that we had on how students used to see a decrease in their learning levels during summer break. This is a type of research that mainly comes from a US education-based perspective, but it is very helpful to sort of see what the impacts of X amount of time without in-person instruction were. And what researchers have done is that they have extrapolated all of these expectations, and they have fitted models to understand how different alternatives of schooling, ranging from school closures of different lengths to full in-person instruction, can configure different scenarios for the learning expectations. But still, we need to be really insistent that these are projections, that these are estimation, and that only in some cases this will be more precise findings. And luckily, there seems to be more and more of that evidence produced lately. But still, it was important for me to make that distinction. So since most of the evidence we do corresponds to projections and estimations, it is also very hard to account for the specific effects of school closures in pooled terms, right? So the only claim I will make here is that there is sufficient evidence, or at least sufficient hints, to accept that the longest the period with school closed, the greater the consequences on student outcomes. Student outcomes such as learning loss, such as school dropout, or disrupted socio-emotional development, which are the most typical consequences we will discuss here. And there is, however, a very impactful and clear piece of data about the overall impact of this crisis over learners, and it's right there on the screen. And it has to do with the economic costs of this disruption, of this discontinuity in children's learning trajectory. And that data is that for the current generation, the economic losses associated with the interruption of in-person schooling could ascend to $17 trillion, which is a fairly large share of today's global GDP. So we're talking about something that, although in many countries, is still not considered a severe catastrophe, a severe crisis, it is going to have an impact both in the economic dimension of our collective life in societies, and eventually it will get to also probably have some impact on the quality of the social cohesion within our societies. It might be a factor driving greater inequity levels, which might at the same time have a negative impact on the democratic quality in our societies. So all this comes to say that although we do acknowledge the lack of sufficient evidence from every single country in the world, we do have enough evidence or enough reasons to believe that this crisis, that has not necessarily been the health crisis, but the decisions we have made about what to do with schools are going to configure a really complex scenario for the next years or for the next decade. But if we move to the next slide, we can begin to see that some international reports, such as this one you're looking at on the screen, edited by the World Bank, that do describe the scope and magnitude of these consequences, drawing on the most important pieces of evidence produced internationally. As I said, not all of this evidence corresponds to official government data-based evidence, but they do come from very respectful academic institutions, or in some cases, civil society institutions. There are fulfilling that void of evidence that governments have not been able to fulfill. And it covers evidence from countries in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. So it allows us to have access to a very large international perspective. And this is important because although I will explain with more detail results and impacts on Mexico, it is very important to understand that when we talk about opportunities for innovation, that necessarily means learning collectively, cooperating internationally, and being able to help countries that are facing similar challenges to come up with decisions in shorter time spans. We need to have shorter learning curves to be more successful in countering, in mitigating the negative effects of the pandemic. So the fact that institutions like the World Bank, and as we see other institutions like the OECD, are continuously making the efforts to produce international and comparative evidence, we should be very aware of the potential that has to help our countries to share with each other what our learnings are and what best practices could inform our own decision-making locally. So now I would like to zoom in some of the results that we find evidence of in Mexico. So if we move us one slide forward, please, we will see two charts that are part of a recent paper published on November 2021 that talks about the impact of the pandemic, or more specifically, the impact of school closures on student learning. As I said, this is not government data. It is evidence, however, that was raised and processed by Mexicanos Primero. This is the institution where I work, and that is thereby considered a citizen-led assessment. But the sampling design and the analytical design, they do allow us to claim that these findings can be used for inference about the scenario of most of Mexico's student population. So what you see there is a pattern that we believe most likely be present in other countries as well. On the charts on the left, we see what is the increase in learning loss levels, both in reading and in math, controlling by students' socioeconomical level, socioeconomical status. And what we see there is that not only on average or in general do learning loss levels tend to grow, but that they grow even more wherever students are facing the poorest economic conditions. So this is probably not new for anybody doing work on international development or doing work on education as a path to greater social mobility or social justice, because we do know that traditionally learning gaps exist, and that these learning gaps affect negatively those students that live in the most marginalized conditions, economically, socially, right? And in this case, we also see that the gaps are larger in math, which is also something very interesting. We wouldn't be sure that this is the case in every single country. Locally, we see that that's where the gap becomes the most evident. We did not catch that evident gaps whenever separating results of boys and girls, but it's all about economic level, and specifically in the case of math, that becomes really, really evident. For reasons of time and space, I did not include here any results about data on the socio-emotional status of students and families, but I will share that this research showed us that almost in every household, we surveyed 2,000 households in two southern states in the country. So the research showed that in almost every household, it is possible to account for the impact of the pandemic, both on the health and the loss of lives of family members, and in the impact of the prolonged confinement, which has definitely taken a toll on people's mental health and well-being. And finally, what this data does not show is what are other types of impact that unfortunately are impacting children's life, like an increase on physical and emotional abuse from family and community members, or how not attending schools makes students stop receiving some very important supports, like vaccination or nutritional supplementary programs, right? So it is, as I said, a very significant piece of evidence that probably, it is representative of other countries as well, but in this case, highlights what's the actual impact of the pandemic on students in Mexico. So what can we do? Next slide, please. That is the question I want to take us to now. What can we do? And before talking about what can we do, I will talk about what could we do, which is the question I asked my team two years ago when we were first confronted with this crisis scenario. Next slide, please. So on February 2020, I was barely starting my tenure as General Director in Mexicanos Primero Sinaloa. I had had the opportunity to return to Mexico from Chile, to transition from roles leading school intervention projects, working with teachers, into a more policy-oriented line of work and institution. During a 10-year period before the pandemic, I had actually all of my professional experience had been in projects aimed at decreasing or eliminating these learning gaps, bringing about greater social justice through a better education quality in countries in Latin America. And in this region of the world, which is where I have had all of my professional experience, it was clear that there were some very severe learning gaps between the most privileged and the most marginalized students. And that was pre-pandemic, right? And although we had made significant progress bringing all students or most students to school, bringing education to most corners of our countries, there was still a big issue with quality and with equity concerns. So to us, it was very obvious at the beginning that the negative effects emerging from this crisis, we didn't know what they were going to do, but we do had enough reasons to suppose that this unknown phenomena was going to cause a greater damage on those students starting off with clearer disadvantages. And I think that the slides I already shared sort of confirm that hypothesis, that this was going to be a crisis where big inequities were going to configure different outcomes for different people. And as the work I have been lucky to do in Teach for All partner countries, I am a Enseña Chile, Teach for Chile alum, so I was a teacher with them for a couple of years. And then I had the opportunity to work in Teach for Mexico and move back to work with Teach for Chile. So all of that experience in these Teach for All network countries showed me that there were efforts being made by a large community of specialists, by a large community of leaders in the international education field. So it was clear that this crisis was in many ways also an opportunity to deeply challenge ourselves, to challenge the assumptions of what education should be, about the roles of schools in our societies, and most importantly, about how education could be conceived as a place and as an opportunity for collective leadership to emerge and to guide a systemic transformation. And these were the types of reflections that I entered, that came to me when we needed to reconfigure all of our annual plan. The COVID pandemic hit Mexico and hit us in Mexicanos Primero with a yearly plan that was already designed. Our yearly plan was ready by January 2020, and all schools in Mexico closed in March 2020. So that meant a complete reconfiguration of our efforts. And the details of all of those reflections can be found in a chapter on this book, on leading education through COVID, where alongside many other educational leaders and colleagues from Harvard Graduate School of Education, we share some personal experiences in confronting this crisis that has, for many of us, been a very big invitation to reflect on our own personal leadership. And most important, I think that this kind of collaborative spaces for collective reflection helped us to see that there were going to be some very real and unique opportunities for innovation to arise, and that we could seize those opportunities both to respond to the actual present crisis better, but to prepare for future crisis scenarios as well, and also to reconsider what are the type of changes that are necessarily not only to restore education systems to their old self, but to build back better versions of themselves. Because we must not forget, we were faced with dramatic inequities prior to the pandemic. So coming back to doing what we did before the pandemic is not necessarily going to lead us to a better off position for everybody, right? So these were the type of reflections that accompanied me and our team when we were first confronted with this pandemic and with this crisis. So if we move us to the next slide, please. I would like to talk about how innovation has finally been a way for education systems to find a surviving toolkit. How innovation has meant, in many cases, the survival and the continuity of education systems, and how, therefore, innovation became a way of responding to the immediate challenges of this crisis. So I will talk about innovation as response. Next slide, please. And to organize this part of the presentation, I will propose that, as I said, it was innovation that kept education systems on the go. In times of disruption and uncertainty, many of the decisions that had to be taken were confronted with huge levels of uncertainty. And that challenged the status quo in so many ways that I believe it forced a somewhat forced innovation period. Everybody had to innovate, and they were forced to do it. There was no way of doing that. So I will address how these opportunities to innovate manifested in 3 different domains or dimensions. The first one is how this crisis expanded the school ecosystem and how it added a new digital layer to what we now consider schooling to be. Second, I will talk about how, through the use of data, new opportunities have emerged for decision makers and for decision-making protocols about what to do with our schools and with our education systems. And related to that, I will explain how the pandemic also created a window of opportunity to rethink how the governance of schools and the capacity to make decisions in schools became redistributed in ways that might be beneficial for greater levels of democratization across education systems. So if we move to the next slide, we can start talking about the first dimension, how technology has created not only the opportunity for education systems to continue to stay alive, but to bring about a very relevant type of change, which I believe is an ecological type of change. Because if we consider education as an ecosystem, I think it is pretty obvious by now that the physical notion of schools we used to know is now accompanied by the idea that learning can also be pursued remotely by using digital connectivity tools, like the ones we're using here, we're using for this conference to take place, or like the many other tools that kept education systems running all across the world. And of course, this does not mean only online instruction. It also means all of the other different alternatives that were used by governments to keep remote instruction going. It means, for instance, in the case in the case of countries like Mexico, the use of television as a conveyor for educational content. In other places, it means the use of radio as a tool. And in many places in the world, it means the use of social media communication, social apps on our cell phones, like WhatsApp, which in the case of Mexico as well, has been by far the largest conveyor of educational interactions between families and schools during this time. So I believe that here we will most likely see, if we're already not seeing, or if we are already not experiencing that, and a spike in the increase and creation of new services for online social interaction oriented towards learning. And these tools will create, as I said, an extended ecosystem, a new digital layers around schools. And I believe that this eventually is going to give us the opportunity to maximize learning, not restricting it to school walls. However, I think it's also very important to be aware of the fact that this new layer can also be the source of even greater levels of inequity, right? So the first question here is the question of whether educational agents all across countries, all across regions within countries, all across all types of schools, have the capacities to adopt a digitalized approach for instruction and to manage education system. So do teachers have that capacity? Do school principals have that capacity? Do mid-level officers within the public education bureaucracies have that capacity? And that's one very important concern in terms of equity around this new digital layer created around schools. Second, there is a question about the type of changes in teacher professional development that are required to shift from an exclusively in-person instruction to a blended, or we can name that mixed or hybrid modality of instruction, right? So are we prepared for the changes in pedagogy that are required to maximize the benefits of this digital layer that we added to traditional schooling? And finally, and most importantly, there is the question of how are countries to address the digital divide in infrastructure and connectivity that many schools and communities, especially in marginalized communities, still face, right? And this is, of course, essential to greater levels of equity when it comes to taking advantage of the benefits of this process of digitalization. And we are starting to see some very promising alternatives to democratize access to internet connectivity. For instance, let me share with you that very recently, a pilot of bringing satellite internet connectivity to rural communities is being piloted in Chile. And I believe those are very promising alternatives. This is done in partnership with Starlink, which is Elon Musk's company that has the mission of connecting every single corner of our planet to satellite internet. And this could be a game changer, right? But we need to consider not only this matter in terms of access, but also in terms of the capacities that education leader and practitioners have to actually make this into an opportunity for greater equity. Next slide, please. Second, I would like to discuss a domain in which I believe innovation has also allowed education systems to respond to the emergency. This is a picture of the School Return Index, which is a tool created by Mexicanos Primero to orient the decision of where and when to reopen schools. By drawing on public data available for over 140,000 primary and secondary schools, and crossing that data with relevant demographic data from families, from households, and from data about the levels of intensity of the pandemic, we were able to create a model that could balance both the need, the urgency of schools to resume in-person instruction, and the levels of opportunity of such schools to return to in-person instruction. So what we were trying to do through data, through innovation, was to balance the right to keeping healthy with the right to resuming the educational trajectory interrupted by school closures, that, as we already saw, is having very negative effects on students' learning, especially in those learners that live in the most marginalized communities. So in experiences, these type of projects, there are no blueprints. Many of the decisions you need to make when you create a project like this are based on discretion and are thereby necessarily biased. In this case, we actually opted for a very explicit equity-oriented bias so that we could make sure that all of our analytical model was prioritizing that we would identify which schools had not only the greatest necessity to resume in-person instruction, but the greatest opportunity to do so, right? So that we would avoid greater levels of learning loss by identifying which schools should be the first to reopen, and in ways that allowed us to advocate for them, right? To be the actually first to resume in-person instruction and to receive targeted support from educational authorities. Again, this is a tool created by civic society organizations. This is not a tool created by a government. And unfortunately, it has only been partially used by decision makers to craft plans to resume in-person instruction in the country. Specifically, in the case of Sinaloa, which is the state where I live and work, we were able to see that after providing the government with a report that informed about the different recommendations for all Sinaloan schools included in this project, there was a clear prioritization of these schools. And we did see that the schools with the greatest urgency and the greatest facilities to resume in-person instruction were actually the first ones to resume in-person instruction, the first schools on the list of the reopening process. But unfortunately, we have not been successful in getting the federal government, the national government, on board of using this type of tool to organize the reopening of schools in a more effective manner. And we have not been successful either in having families interested in learning what is the specific profile for their children's schools. And thereby families have not used this information and the recommendations issued by the platform to demand a more effective management from the school and the state government authorities. But we believe that if we, as a civic society organization with a very small team, all of our network does not comprise more than 30 collaborators, with a very limited budget and with a very limited access to data, if we were able to create a tool to drive, to organize the process of school reopenings on data, I believe that this is an opportunity access that most governments can access, and is definitely a very interesting avenue for greater levels of innovation. And if we move to the next slide, we will get to the third dimension, which has to do with how decisions were made during the crisis. And I will address how transforming schools into community learning centers in Sinaloa became a very good opportunity to innovate in the way that decisions were traditionally made in schools in Mexico. So Mexico has a very centralized education system. First, national authorities make pretty much all of the policy, all the relevant decisions. In some cases, that decision is shared with local state governments, but pretty much the role of school communities is to follow what national or local authorities tell them to do, right? And there have been some attempts to democratize this, to increase, participation from parental associations, or to allow schools to determine a portion of its curriculum locally. But this is more, both of these are more administrative possibilities than things that schools are actually really doing in their everyday life. And for instance, the decision to close schools was a decision completely made by the federal government, a centralized decision made by the federal government on March 2020. However, the decision to reopen schools was granted to schools as a voluntary decision. And that created a very important window of opportunity because there was not a guideline, there was not a ready-made process for communities to make that decision. So what we saw is that communities value different things to decide whether to reopen their schools or not. First, I want to explain what a community learning center is, and there are some publications there. Unfortunately, the most important of those publications is in Spanish, in Mexicanos Primeros website, but there is a chapter on this book on an educational calamity where we show some of the most important consultancy aspects that made us suggest to the state government of Sinaloa to design and implement this strategy. And a community learning center is basically a school that receives authorization to operate under a strict set of restrictions, like a shorter schedule, like lower levels of daily attendance, to provide academic and socio-emotional support for students that do not have adequate conditions to access remote learning instruction. And this modality of schooling through community learning centers transferred the decision to reopen schools to communities. This, in many ways, allowed to bypass the low political willingness to reopen schools that politicians and teacher unions had, which was a very important barrier where in all of the process where Mexicanos Primeros Sinaloa was trying to get schools to reopen. And this had to do with the fact that last year we had local government and local parliament elections in Sinaloa, right? So by making the decision volunteer, decision makers sort of said, this is not our responsibility. You go ahead and decide, which is rare because, as I said, most decisions are made so centrally. But not only in terms of decision making, the COVID pandemic brought new opportunities for innovation. Because if we move to the next slide, through this methodology, through this intervention of schools transformed into community learning centers, we were also able to see ways in which in-person schooling was different from traditional in-person schooling during the pandemic, despite all of these restrictions, despite all of these constraints. And these ideas are expressed in a chapter on this book, edited recently by UNESCO. And I will only mention some of those ideas. For instance, the fact that schools were operating with lower levels of attendance allowed a more personalized support to be delivered to students. And this is a kind of support that means a more closely tailored approach based on the specific needs of each student. And this is something completely different from what students typically get on a regular in-person school day in Mexico. It's difficult to accomplish because a teacher is now working with 4 or 5 students during a 2-hour period instead of working with 40 or 45 students during the same time span. So it's a dramatic difference. Second, schools as community learning centers were allowed to balance, to have a greater prioritization of socio-emotional needs of learners. So it's not about pure academics now. It's also about what's going on with children's mental health, with their emotional and social development and competencies. And this might seem like something that was already going on before the pandemic, but if you looked at most national education evaluation systems, there were only a few of them which were actually making sure to measure, to track students' socio-emotional learning and development as a priority. And I think that the pandemic definitely shifted that. And finally, parental engagement. A critical process, like reopening school, is now allowing parents to participate in decision-making, in decisions that are relevant in schools. And I believe that that creates also great innovation opportunities to increase the quality, to increase the level of importance of the partnerships between families and schools. And by the way, this is a great book because you will find innovative practices from a vast array of countries, focusing on different categories, student-centered modes of instruction, deeper learning, social-emotional learning and well-being, teacher and principal professional development, and family engagement. So I definitely recommend checking this book out for anybody who is interested in exploring the types of innovation that occurred globally during these times of disruptions. And finally, there are other institutions such as the OECD or the Brookings institutions that have also published systematized reports on the types of innovations that have emerged spontaneously across education systems through the world. So finally, if we move to the last slide of my presentation, what does the future and the post-pandemic scenario has to offer in terms of innovation? Next slide, please. I think I wanna leave us with this recommendation. Recently, the UNESCO published this report, this third very important report about the futures of education, where they make a clear statement about the necessity for greater levels of innovation across different dimensions to be pursued. They believe that in order to renew the way we understand and reenact the role of education in our societies, we need to reimagine the futures of our education in a way that is interconnected, in a way that is globally pursued. And I believe that this is finally a very interesting avenue for innovation. This book is based on 2 foundational principles. The first one is that now when we talk about the right to quality education, this should be a right through life, not only to K-12, not only to K-12 and higher ed, but beyond, through all of our lifespan. And the second foundational principle is that education should be strengthened as a public endeavor and as a common good, as a shared social endeavor, which allow us to build common purposes and enable individuals and communities to flourish together. And this create, again, new, very interesting pathways for innovation to happen in the way we make decisions and drive change collectively. So with this recommendation, I will finish my presentation so that we can have time to receive maybe a couple of questions or comments from the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for such an engaging discussion and enlightening us with your wonderful thoughts. So we have a few questions for you from our participants. So the first question is, what are the motivational factors that can be taken into consideration for the learners as well as the educators in this pandemic situation? This has been asked by Mr. Pratik N.
Thank you very much for that question. I think that that question touches a very important point, which is how important it is for education systems to engage students as key drivers of the decisions, because students are the ones that know the best the type of things that motivate them. We've been able and we've been lucky enough to talk with many students across different schools and regions within the country, and they are able to identify so many ways in which this disruption has been also positive for them. Let me talk briefly about two of them. So many of them are saying, by working more time independently, we are able to experience learning at a different pacing, at a pacing that we feel like we benefit more from. So they would feel, the students would tell us that traditional schooling was set up in a pace that was not necessarily always challenging for them. And this was different when they had more capacity to be able to define their own pacing, their own rhythm, their own topics of interest. And I believe that that's absolutely fundamental. And the second thing is how not attending to school every day with a long school schedule also allows students to develop other interests, to develop other talents. We have learned that for students, not the most relevant learnings of these times have not necessarily had to do with the national curriculum, but we're learning things that are useful and helpful in their everyday life, like skating, or like learning how to cook, or how to ride a bicycle, or how to ride a motorcycle, which are things that make sense, that are relevant in the type of life experiences they have in their communities. So I believe that the greatest motivators should come from children and from student experience directly.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for clarifying our participants' doubts through your in-depth knowledge. It's been indeed a pleasure to listen to your valuable views. Your spontaneous views on the innovation opportunities that COVID-19 brought to education system is quite relatable to all of us, as we all belong to the academic field. We are thankful to you for sharing lots of things with us, what you explored during this pandemic and in this academic structure. So I'm sure all of us are going to have a better understanding from now onwards about the current educational system post-pandemic. Thank you once again for spending your time for all of us. Thank you. Thank you once again, sir. Over to Professor Masaki.